You send a message that feels warm, normal, and easy to answer. Then nothing comes back. Hours turn into days, and the silence starts to feel considerably louder than any actual reply ever could. Modern researchers call this specific pattern ghosting, someone who simply stops responding, without warning and without any real explanation, ending a connection through pure deliberate absence rather than through any actual honest conversation. Real psychological research has identified several specific patterns behind why people choose this path, and Carl Jung's broader understanding of persona and avoidance adds a genuinely useful, deeper layer to why silence so often feels like the easier option. Actual research into ghosting has identified a specific cluster of reasons people give for choosing disappearance over direct conversation. Convenience ranks among the most common, simply finding it easier to vanish than to have an uncomfortable conversation. A perceived lack of communication skills follows closely. People genuinely believing they do not have the actual words or the actual composure needed to end things honestly and directly. Some report having tried other approaches first, only giving up on direct communication after the other person refused to accept an earlier, gentler attempted rejection. And a smaller but rare group report ghosting specifically to spare the other person's feelings, genuinely believing silence causes less pain than an honest, direct conversation would. Jung's understanding adds something genuinely useful underneath these specific researched reasons. He believed that most people build a persona, a curated, presentable version of themselves shown to the world, one considerably more comfortable and confident than their actual, complete inner experience. Ending a relationship honestly and directly requires this persona to step aside temporarily, exposing something considerably more vulnerable and more genuinely uncomfortable underneath. Real guilt, real difficulty articulating what has actually changed, a real confrontation with your own disowned material. Whatever specific shadow quality made this connection genuinely too difficult to sustain honestly. Ghosting allows a person to avoid this exposure entirely, maintaining the comfortable, composed persona by simply removing themselves from the situation rather than ever having to reveal the messier, more vulnerable truth underneath it. This explains why researchers consistently find that people who ghost frequently describe feeling genuine guilt and relief simultaneously, since disappearing does successfully protect the persona from an uncomfortable confrontation, while the guilt reflects the part of the psyche that recognizes, even if only vaguely, that something genuine and honest was actually avoided rather than resolved. This also explains why the person on the receiving end experiences something psychologically distinct from an ordinary direct rejection, since research confirms that being ghosted produces measurably more lingering attachment and more prolonged difficulty finding closure than being told directly that a relationship is over. Precisely because the mind, denied any actual explanation, keeps actively searching for meaning that direct communication would have simply provided. Here is what makes this understanding genuinely useful for anyone who recognizes this pattern in their own behavior. Research suggests that people higher in traits like narcissism, manipulation, or genuine lack of empathy do ghost more frequently, and this deserves honest acknowledgement. But research also confirms this is not the entire picture. Many people who ghost are not lacking empathy in a stable, permanent sense. They are, in that specific moment, avoiding a genuine confrontation with their own vulnerability, their own inadequate communication skills, or their own disowned discomfort. Precisely the kind of shadow material Jung believed becomes considerably more manageable once it is actually, honestly faced rather than fled from. Here is what actually helps if you recognize this pattern in your own behavior. It helps to notice honestly the next time you feel the pull to simply disappear rather than communicate directly what specific discomfort you are actually trying to avoid. Guilt, inadequate words, genuine fear of the other person's reaction, since naming this discomfort precisely is the necessary first step toward eventually tolerating it long enough to communicate honestly instead. It also helps to practice in low stakes situations brief, direct communication, even when avoidance would be considerably easier, building genuine confidence that honest, difficult conversations are actually survivable, considerably more survivable than the avoided persona's fear typically predicts. Here is what actually helps if you have been on the receiving end of this specific silence. Real research offers a genuinely useful reframe worth taking seriously. That ghosting reflects considerably more about the ghoster's own avoidance and limitations than it does about your actual worth or the genuine value of the connection itself. Choosing to interpret an unexplained disappearance as information about the other person's own unresolved patterns, rather than as an accurate verdict on your own value, is not simply comforting self talk. It is, according to both the research and Jung's understanding, considerably closer to the actual truth of what happened. If you recognize this pattern of disappearing rather than communicating directly, hear this clearly. This was never simply a personal failing with nothing further to understand. According to Jung's understanding, combined with modern research, it very often reflects a persona protecting itself from a genuine, uncomfortable confrontation, one that deserves honest examination rather than continued, automatic avoidance. Think honestly about the last relationship you ended or considered ending, through silence rather than direct communication, and consider what specific discomfort you were actually avoiding in that exact moment, right below the single word for that specific discomfort. Naming it honestly and practicing direct, honest communication even in low stakes situations is the real and practical way you begin building genuine tolerance for the discomfort that honest endings actually require. There is a final piece worth naming, since it applies regardless of which side of this pattern you find yourself on. The actual antidote to ghosting on either side of the exchange is the same value Jung placed at the center of genuine psychological health: honest confrontation with difficult truth rather than avoidance of it. A person who practices facing discomfort directly in small doses and over time genuinely becomes more capable of the honest conversations that silence has always been substituting for. Because disappearing instead of ever saying goodbye was never, according to Carl Jung's understanding and confirmed by real research, simply a character flaw with nothing further to explain. It was very often a persona avoiding genuine vulnerability, and facing that vulnerability directly, however uncomfortable, was always the real practical alternative to the silence that so reliably leaves both people considerably worse off than an honest, if difficult, conversation ever would.